We now start with our next session, further to the three breakaways which we had. And this session is on a very interesting topic. I know I keep on using the word interesting, but it is really very interesting. And it is this unique amalgamation between spirituality and animal protection. And the challenges and the opportunities that are a part of it. So we begin the session today with four great speakers. Dr. Nanditha Krishna, she is the president of the CP Ramaswami Aiyar Foundation, and I will just introduce her at length shortly. Our second speaker is Wolf Gordon Clifton. Our third speaker is Manoj Gautam, and our fourth speaker is Joyce Tischler. So to begin with the session and begin with the introduction of our first speaker, Dr. Nanditha Krishna, who's a historian in She holds a PhD in ancient Indian culture from Bombay University and a doctorate in literature from Vidyasagar University, West Bengal. She is a member of the governing body of Blue Cross of India and founder of Blue Cross of Kanchipuram. She has been a professor and research guide for the PhD program of CPR Institute of Indological Research, affiliated to the University of Madras. She is the founder and honorary director of CPR Environmental Education Center and president of the CP Ramaswamy Aiyar Foundation. Dr. Nanditha Krishna has written 23 books and several articles and papers on Indian culture and environment, including Sacred Animals of India, Sacred Plants of India, and Hinduism and Nature. Dr. Nanditha Krishna, we welcome you and over to you, please.
Hinduism, life's goal is the achievement of dharma or the law of righteousness. It has been defined in the Mahabharata as that which one should never do to another, which one regards as injurious to one's own self. That, in brief, is the rule of dharma. Divinity is present in all creation, human, animal and plant, and all creation is divine. Most importantly, the soul does not die with the body but is reborn in other life forms which depend on the karmas or actions in each life. Every action determines the next birth of the soul. Thus, reincarnation or the cycle of birth, death and rebirth will continue until the soul achieves a state of perfection and liberation or moksha, becoming one with the Supreme Being. All life forms must go through this process. In this law of karma, there are serious repercussions for causing suffering and pain to another life, or even for supporting cruelty in any form. Killing another life is a great sin, and it is in this that we see the importance of compassion towards animals. A good person may be reborn in a higher plane of life, an evil person as a suffering laboratory rat. Thus, to achieve a good rebirth, one has to live a life of dharma, and accepting animals as equally being on the path towards the Supreme Being is essential. Ahimsa or non-violence in thought, word and action is an essential part of dharma. The concept of non-killing appears in the earliest literature, the Vedas. Ahimsa is a unique concept inspired by the belief that the Supreme Being lives in all living beings, human and animal. Therefore, to hurt another being is to open oneself to possible karmic repercussions. Here I must mention that the oldest religious book, the Rig Veda, condemns all forms of killing, even for food, and includes drinkers of milk. I'll quote the passage. One who fills himself with the flesh of man, he who fills himself with the flesh of horses or of other animals, and he who steals the milk of the cow, Lord, cut off their heads with your flame. It's a little drastic, but that is how strong the writer was in his belief, and the sage who wrote this was probably the world's first vegan. Yajurveda says you must not use your God given body for killing God's creatures, whether they are human or animal. And the earliest reference to the idea of non violence to animals, or Pashu Ahimsa, is in the Yajurveda. Ahimsa became central to all later Vedic literature, especially the Upanishads, which speak time and again of ahimsa and compassion towards all, especially towards animals, rejecting sacrifice and rejecting anything that causes suffering to another life. The practitioner of ahimsa is said to escape the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. In the hymn to the earth of the Atharva Veda, the poet says, "Born of thee, on thee move mortal creatures. Thou bearest them, the biped and the quadruped. Thine, O earth, are the races for whom the sun, as he rises, spreads his rays." In 200 BC, the Tamil saint Thiruvalluvar spoke of compassion and the non-killing of animals for food as the basis of dharma, which is the main theme of the first book, Aram or Dharma. According to the Tirukkural, the greatest virtue is non-killing, and the greatest sin is killing animals and eating meat. By recognizing the divinity in animals, Hinduism gave them a unique proposition which protected many species. Animals were revered for several reasons. The elephant is the creator of pathways through the forest and digs water holes to harvest rainwater. Thus, Ganesha, the elephant god, became the remover of obstacles. Hanuman was a fellow primate, a friend and devotee of Rama. And even today, killing primates, monkeys, or any primate species is a heinous sin. The black buck was essential for the survival of the kejri plant, which was the mainstay of the desert, and it is protected by the Bishnois with their lives. Vagdev and Huliraya are tiger deities, the top predators in the jungles of the Western Ghats, where they are worshipped and protected by the people, and many others, all of whom had an important ecological or social role. Many animals were considered to be vehicles of the gods, called Vahanas in Sanskrit. Many had totemic origins. The dog, who is man's best friend, became a companion of Shiva and wandered through the countryside beside his lord. Krishna, the author of the Bhagavad Gita, preached a religion of love for all creation and gave primacy to the cow that gave milk. The first 4 incarnations of Vishnu, the preserver, were non-human: Matsya, or the fish; Kurma, or the tortoise; Varaha, the boar; and Narasimha, the man-lion. There is an evolutionary aspect in the 10 incarnations. The worship of each sacred element in nature reveals the people's knowledge of the connection between nature and spiritualism, and used nature to protect, and used religion to protect nature. Hindu saints in the ancient, medieval, and modern periods preached total devotion to God and spread the message of kindness to animals and vegetarianism, a message reinforced by saints and gurus in every age, every part of India, that animals have souls and sentience. Although Hinduism did not require its adherents to be vegetarians, vegetarianism has been recognized as a higher form of life, a belief system that continues in contemporary life, where it is considered essential for spiritualism and the liberation of the soul, or moksha. Sanctity of life is integral to Hinduism. Man has no dominion over non-human life forms. The world was not created for humans alone. All lives are of equal value, all have the same right to life and liberty, and all are subject to the law of birth, death and rebirth, which is defined by one's karma. Hinduism respects the natural world, including flora and fauna, creatures in the sky and under the sea. The Supreme Being is the basis for this universe. Non-violence to animals prevents the karmic consequences of violence and cruelty. I would like to end with a prayer from the Rig Veda for all creation. Protect both our species, two-legged and four-legged, both food and water for their needs supply. May they with us increase in stature and strength. Save us all from hurt all our days, O Supreme Power. Namaskar.
Wow, that was such a beautiful presentation, Dr. Krishna. And I think there were so many beautiful things that you mentioned there, and so much of gyan or knowledge, as we say in Hindi. So thank you so much for that great presentation in a way, and all those wonderful insights. With that, we move to our next speaker, Wolf Gordon Clifton, who's the Executive Director of Animal People, a non-profit charity dedicated to raising awareness of animal issues and supporting the global animal protection movement. Wolf holds a master's in museum studies from the University of Washington and is currently working on an MS in geological sciences. Wolf, over to you.
Thank you for attending my presentation, Compassion and Conflict, Buddhism and Confucianism on the Treatment of Animals. Although the two traditions originate separately, I will be discussing them together due to the fact that they share over 2,000 years of common history and mutual influences in China. As a brief note, from here on out I will be using the term Ruism rather than Confucianism, in respect for the fact that practitioners have traditionally self-identified as Ru, meaning scholar or classicist. In Ruism, the highest moral ideal is known as Ren, and refers to an element of human nature which is manifest and cultivated through interactions with others. Ren can be practiced toward non-human animals, as seen in the words of Mencius, one of the most important historic Ruist teachers, who writes, "This is the way of the noble person in regard to animals. If he sees them alive, then he cannot bear to see them die, and if he hears their cries, then he cannot bear to eat their flesh." However, animal slaughter is not forbidden within Ruism. Among the traditions that were first compiled by Confucius and passed down to later generations of Ruists were practices of animal sacrifice. Ritual in general, not just sacrifice, but other forms of ceremony, rules of social etiquette, etc., were seen as critical for maintaining social values. For historical context, Confucius and his earliest disciples lived during a period of political conflict and anarchy, which contributed to their belief that society could be restored to a state of peace and harmony by restoring the traditions practiced under more peaceful past eras. For this reason, rituals should not be reformed lightly. In Buddhism, the ultimate spiritual goal is to realize non-attachment, which in turn leads to a realization of one's interconnection with all beings, leading to universal compassion for all beings. In part for this reason, meat consumption is restricted in Buddhism, although it is not outright forbidden in the earliest dated Buddhist texts. Monks and nuns, who in early Buddhism were dependent on begging for food, were allowed to accept donations of meat provided it was not seen or heard or suspected that an animal had been killed on their behalf. And lay followers were forbidden from working in the meat industry, not from eating meat. As Buddhism spread into China, it became more overtly pro-vegetarian, due in part to social factors, such as the rise of large monasteries with their own means of food production, which gave monks and nuns a choice in the type of food that they ate. Political interventions were also involved, as by Emperor Wu of Liang, one of the first Buddhist emperors who came to favor and promote the vegetarian position. Over time, Buddhist arguments for vegetarianism came to incorporate Ruist concepts. However, Ruists themselves largely rejected Buddhist teachings on vegetarianism and against animal sacrifice, with some arguing that even though compassion for animals is a virtue in Ruism too, it is important to moderate it and subordinate it, lest it come to erode the special importance of relationships between human beings. Ruists came to see themselves as defenders of traditional Chinese civilization against the innovations and imports of Buddhism. That said, despite the historical positions taken by each religion, it can't be taken for granted that these still hold true today. Both traditions were violently disrupted during the 19th and 20th centuries, early on by Western imperialism, and later during episodes such as the Cultural Revolution, in which religion in general was repressed within China. Political factors continue to shape each tradition within China, as do social phenomena, such as the rise of veganism and vegetarianism motivated more by secular values rather than spiritual ones. Globalization has increased interaction between Chinese Buddhism and Ruism and other forms of each tradition in other countries. In the Theravada schools of Buddhism, and in most schools of Japanese Buddhism, vegetarianism is not emphasized as it has been in Chinese Buddhism. In recent decades, a new movement sometimes called Boston Confucianism has emerged within the United States, and includes Ruist practitioners who seek to reinterpret their traditions within a specifically Western cultural context. The challenges of modernity have led to debates within both Ruism and Buddhism as to the relative importance of historical practices and doctrines versus modern innovations and reinterpretations. In conclusion, despite taking different historical positions on the treatment of animals, both Buddhism and Ruism link compassion for animals to core beliefs and values. History is precedent, not destiny, and it is up to modern Buddhist and Ruist practitioners, as well as animal activists reaching out to these communities, or hailing from within them, to shape their religion's future regarding the treatment of animals. Here are a few recommendations for further reading, and a link to a longer version of this presentation with a bibliography. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wolf, for that fantastic presentation. We have now Manoj Gautam. Manoj is the Executive Director of the Jain Goodall Institute in Nepal, which works in the field of research, conservation, and education. A conservationist and as an animal welfare advocate, Manoj's special focus lies towards devising long-term sustainable systems to address conservation and animal welfare issues. Through community engagement and partnerships with government at the base level, Manoj has led various successful initiatives that aim at creating social and administrative systems that induce human behavioral change and are self relying. Over to you, Manoj.
From Nepal. I will be talking about a case study from Namkha rural municipality, where we'll basically be talking about two demographic units within the same rural municipality. Both are Buddhist constituencies, basically. But before that, just wanted to highlight how we talking about spirituality or religion and animal protection and the nexus, how we usually tend to play. Much effort goes in the understanding and interpretation and reinterpretation or counter-interpretation of the doctrine in its purest form, the doctrine or the philosophical foundation of these lines of spirituality or religious practices. What happens with the doctrine and any play with the intellectual, in the intellectual level, is that it gets fairly limited in terms of its mass outreach, because even the doctrine's interpretation and dissemination of the messages, on behalf of the religious dogmas or doctrines, has to basically go through some influencers throughout the history of Buddhism, particularly talking about. We've seen the influences of Padmasambhava and Shanta Rakshita and so on and so forth. So one of the things that, from my case study, one demographic unit is Limi Valley, where Kagyu schooling of Buddhism has been followed for the past at least 1500 years. It is very much isolated, secluded little unit of Tibetan Buddhism, basically, where a very strong discipline of Kagyu Buddhism has been followed, where the social norms, the social discipline, the environmental discipline, and ahimsa related discipline have been practiced in its purest form, if I may. Which can be seen in some factual evidences like the existence of wild yak population that doesn't exist anywhere else in the country, despite of the fact that pretty much throughout the stretch, that Himalayan stretch, it is pretty much the same constituency, Buddhism constituency, but we do see these evidential facts that are a result of a strict discipline in terms of environmental codes and social codes and ahimsa code as well. There are also, regarding killing livestock, there are some strict rules, but despite of all the efforts, the meat eating as a practice among the monks themselves still continues, and very much the practice is very much dictated or influenced by shamanism as well. And this is a legacy of 1500 years of pretty much purist following of the practice. Now, coming to Yelbang, another demographic unit within Namkha rural municipality, one thing that we notice is a monastery basically focusing on the Mingmapa schooling of Buddhism, was set in Yelbang in 1985, and just in a couple of decades, the very pragmatist, even beyond the doctrines, and a basic philosophical understanding, which has not changed. Basically, it has always been the same. But because of the influence of Guru Rinpoches and lamas in the local areas, within pretty much a decade and a half or so, meat-free communities. And I should remind you that these are mountain terrain, very much limited. So there are economic barriers, there are ecological barriers, climatic barriers, and so many barriers. And this particular community has defied all that, which is why this local community tends to depend so much on meat eating. And yet these influences, these very pragmatic and practical influences from the local monastery and Guru Rinpoches have had amazing results in being able to create meat-free societies and the upgrading and updating of the and standardization of moral and ethical codes within these spiritual and religious practices have been achieved because of this improvisation and because of basically practical undertakings by these newly created institutions, as compared to even to a much more upgraded level and a stronger sense of ahimsa, concept of ahimsa, as compared to Limi Valley. So another interesting observation throughout the area, which also comes from my own thesis, actually, is the understanding that wherever, if we basically see the local communities in more of an institutional framework, I'm borrowing Eleanor Strom's institutional framework, where we can see the three different layers. One is the constitutional level that basically dictates overarching rules and regulations of a community, and then comes the collective choice level of institution, and then the operational level. Historically, because these constituencies have been either governed or semi-governed by these religious or spiritual entities like monasteries, wherever these monasteries still play or are still positioned in the constitutional level status, they're very one can see very strong sense of ahimsa practices, the social codes and environmental codes, and the practice of compassion in general is very much strong, and vice versa. Basically, wherever these institutions have withered, this domain basically of the social, environmental, and the interaction of human and animals have been basically withered as well and degraded. So one space of working for interventionists and for activists like ourselves, particularly basically talking about the nexus of animal welfare agencies and these spiritual agencies, is there's a strong nexus, that working space that could basically generate much desired positive changes. So seeking help from these institutions, and then helping these institutions to regain that position on that constitutional level, rather than playing much with the doctrines and philosophical foundational philosophical related things, would be more a pragmatic thing to do for our cause. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manoj, for those wonderful insights. And we would like to now welcome Joyce Tischler, Professor of Practice, Animal Law, Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School in the US. She is also an attorney who has devoted her career to advancing the field of animal law. In 1979, Joyce co-founded the first US non-profit dedicated to protecting animals using the legal system, the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Today, Joyce teaches industrial animal agriculture law and policy and the fundamentals of animal law, the survey course. She has co-authored Animal Law, New Perspectives on Teaching Traditional Law, and is now co-authoring a first-of-its-kind case book on industrial animal agriculture law. Over to you, Joyce.
I was not given a concept of God when I was a child. My parents never spoke of God. They're gone now, and although I've tried, I've not been able to develop a sense of God, at least not as a noun. But many years ago, a very wise rabbi said to me, yes, God is a noun, but it's also a verb. And it took me a while to understand that way of thinking. But today I see it as a way of living. It guides the choices that I make on a daily basis. God is whatever I do that brings out the best in me. God is what draws me closer to growing into the person that I truly want to be. God is active, not passive. God is more about doing than merely believing. When I choose to be compassionate, patient, ethical, creative, or giving, I grow closer to God. And sometimes I fail, which helps me to stay humble. The work that I do to protect animals is a reflection of my understanding of God. I use my skills as a lawyer to protect animals from harm and suffering. Sometimes I'm asked, if you care about protecting others, why don't you eliminate human suffering first? My answer is that I work for animals precisely because most people choose to ignore their suffering. If God is a verb, then my place in the world is to help human beings open their hearts and their minds to the widespread suffering that my colleagues and I deal with on a daily basis, and to support an end to that suffering. Certain religions teach that human beings are very different from and far superior to all other species. I disagree with that. I believe that in the ways that really matter, we share a great deal in common. Humans are not alone in their ability to feel pain and have a sense of their own life force. We know that dogs and cats and pigs and cows and elephants and chimpanzees are in fact far more intelligent and social than we had previously assumed. They feel pain and pleasure. They form close familial relationships with members of their own species. They grieve the loss of their loved ones. They have emotions, they have preferences, they communicate their needs, and sometimes they even show a sense of humor. I've talked with so many people who have close emotional relationships with dogs and cats. What I've said is quite obvious to them. They consider animals to be members of their family, specifically because animals give us so much on an emotional level. We don't form deep emotional ties with chairs because they can't give anything back. A dog can and does. I think it's a miracle that individuals from different species are able to communicate with each other and form a close emotional bond. Love is when two souls connect, and I've been able to connect deeply with members of other species throughout my lifetime. But we human beings have a very schizophrenic relationship with animals. In my country, people love their dogs and cats. They spend literally billions of dollars on pet food and toys and bedding and veterinary care. And yet at the same time, human beings abuse and exploit 90% of all other living creatures. Each year, billions of land animals are raised for food, and most of these intelligent, sentient creatures live in intensive confinement. They can barely move. They can barely turn around. They can't socialize with others of their own kind as they normally would. They can't do anything that is natural to them. They live out their lives in a persistent state of physical and emotional pain and suffering and frustration because their most basic needs are ignored. And all of this happens because for most people, these animals are commodities, they're things. They're not important enough for human beings to be concerned about their pain. So for me, God means that suffering matters to each individual who experiences it, and therefore suffering matters to me. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a famous American who fought for the abolition of slavery, and she once wrote, "It's a matter of taking the side of the weak against the strong, something the best people have always done." And if God is a verb, then we grow closer to God when we work to end the suffering of those billions of animals who cannot speak for themselves and who desperately need us to speak for them.
Very powerful words there, especially I don't know I remember when I first heard the title of your presentation, um, God is a verb and not a noun. It found such deep resonance with me. And in today's topic, also, I would like to connect the strong statement with um, animal rights, animal care, animal advocacy, whatever term we use, that God is a verb. It's your dharma. It's the actions you do which matter. And this amalgamation goes beyond religions rather. It is what one can say it's spirituality. And I just want to understand from the other speakers also what their thoughts on this aspect of spirituality is. God is not a noun, it's not something that lies in religion per se. It is something that goes so much beyond that in the actions that one does. Like in Hinduism, one says it's your dharma. It's ultimately what becomes your karma also, what results in what your lives thereafter will be like, or whether you reach salvation or moksha, as Hinduism also says, and some other religions also. So, what are your thoughts on that? It's an open question. Dr. Krishna, would you like to perhaps take the lead? You're on mute. Yeah. You have to unmute it.
See, I don't look upon God as something separate from myself. You know, being a practicing Hindu, for me, God is a supreme being, a supreme soul who is inside me. I've got two dogs sitting with me right now. The supreme being is inside the dogs also. So he's everywhere. So I don't think of God as a separate entity, which I think is more a part of the Abrahamic religions, that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. God is a separate entity. Whereas for us, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, God is really a part of us, a part of all creation. So for me, God is everything. You know, it is the law of righteousness. Is God. The fact that we should do good karmas, that is also God, if you want to see it that way. That is what I would say.
Wow, thank you. Wolf, Manoj?
I would like to. I mean, those were really profound, concept, if I may. The idea of God being a noun and a verb. The way I see is, I always have a particular angle to approach any concept from the line of utility. How can I use it for the cause, for the purpose? And also this case study that I just mentioned earlier gives a very beautiful insight to how this force of spirituality actually works on human psyche. And whether we want to talk about the psychological impact or the mental, emotional, physical, even, whichever way we want to see, regardless of how or which particular line of spirituality anybody's following, the impact as if we see all of us as unit of humanity, the impact is pretty much the same. And this belief, whether we believe it in form of noun, or whether the following of spirituality or the concept of God basically, makes us actually practice in certain manner, in a certain discipline. I think it starts with a belief basically, and then the belief develop the attitude, which then kind of is manifested in our practices. What has happened in our current world is there are so many distractions and so many layers of so many things that we have created in our modern world, that the impact of spirituality or even the general practice, it has become very difficult, I think, for us to detect those signs, which is why I have bothered to actually take a reference of a very purist community in the Himalayas, where you see the following, the seeking of divinity, the
the practice of spirituality in its truest sense, where you see a lot of sacrifice, where people go live in a den, basically in a cave in the mountain for 6 years, even, just to be able to become a monk. So you get to see that in its very naked form, if very raw form, which is very inspiring. So I think whichever way we want to believe, if there are less distractions, then the belief basically leads to attitude development, and the attitude basically manifests itself in the form of practice, without which the believing or non-believing in itself would not have any relevance.
I think, Manoj, you mentioned also a point that there have been so many distractions as the world has evolved, as we have evolved as human beings, and evolved maybe in the biological sense, including the mind. They're included, but there have been factors like greed, like that has been the main factor that has resulted in this. Non-violence to such an extent, if I may say so. Yes, a very valid point there. Wolf, would you like to add something to that?
Sure. I think that the broad concept of God as a verb, not a noun, is something that would be applicable to both of the traditions that I spoke about, Buddhism and Ruism. Neither are traditionally theistic religions, so I'd say the spirit of the sentiment is true, less than maybe a literal application. But in Ruism especially, ethical action is really the core of what Confucius and his early disciples were about, even to the extent that there are a couple of passages in the Analects in which one of his disciples will ask him something like, how should we best conduct the rituals to serve spirits? How do we serve the deities? And Confucius just shoots back, you don't even know how to serve people. Why are you worried about serving gods? So treating others here on earth in an ethical manner is the most important part. And in Buddhism as well, you have broadly a strong emphasis on action. I mentioned briefly that the concept of compassion for all beings is thought of as a realization that comes through practices of non-attachment, as you detach from illusion, from emotional burdens, you realize your interconnection with others, which is what leads to compassion for them. And in Mahayana Buddhism, that's called the Bodhisattva ideal. There's this construct of the Bodhisattva as a being, an enlightened or a nearly enlightened being who has the ability to transcend the world, the universe, the cycle of rebirth, but chooses to remain in it, doing compassionate deeds to others, leading them to an end to suffering. So definitely, I think it's a very powerful sentiment. It's something that does cut across in one way or another all of the traditions.
But you mentioned, Wolf, in your presentation about animal sacrifices and also offering meat, which was a part of the earlier forms of the religions you touched upon. What is your take on that? How does that kind of fit into the picture? Ahimsa, non-violence, animal sacrifices, consumption of meat to a certain extent for the sake of survival, perhaps?
Well, I would note, as I noted, the situation is very different for Ruism versus Buddhism. In Buddhism, you did have early on, you still have today in the Theravada schools of Buddhism, that monks and nuns are dependent on donations for their food, which is generally, that's the most common argument that you'll hear as to why early and Theravada Buddhism don't forbid meat consumption outright, is that isn't fair to people who are dependent on the generosity of others. But then in the Mahayana forms of Buddhism, there's a shift away from that. There's sociological reasons, such as the rise of monasteries. But Buddhism, even though the meat question can be controversial, Buddhism, with a few very strange offshoots at a few points in history, has never had animal sacrifice. That's never been a dilemma. Whereas in Ruism, that's something that goes back to the very beginning. And you even have injunctions in which Confucius is asked about abolishing a specific animal sacrifice and emphasizes, no, we need to keep this. That's a bit of a hard legacy to work with. I think for modern Ruism, you really have two different trends. You have what's called sometimes new Confucianism or Boston Confucianism, which I mentioned, that tend to reinterpret the ritual to a large extent, that aren't necessarily attached to historical practices and would be likely to simply say, oh, those old practices, we don't need them anymore. We can do new practices that are more in touch with modern values. But you do still have traditionalists as well, and I think that's something, I mean, animal activists can engage with, but ultimately practitioners are going to have to wrestle with these issues and come to their own decisions.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yes.
Exactly. That is exactly what I wanted to highlight earlier, with my talk as well, because one thing that we observe is, despite of the doctrine or the purity of the doctrine, as much as we like to adhere in our own intellectual practices, while whether we're trying to interpret it, reinterpret it, or counter-interpret it, because one of the things that also with my years of experience with the anti-sacrifice campaign here in the country, there's always some counter ideas about people somehow find this is mentioned in the doctrine and this and that, and also as far as the practice of any, I mean, I'm pretty sure this should be applicable to most, if not all, lines of spirituality or religion or religious sects, even for that matter, that we hardly find any of them basically running on very purist manner, because there's always some sort of interference or some sort of infiltration, amalgamation, assimilation, whatever you want to call it, because we see mostly in our kind of Buddhism here, whether it's Tibetan Buddhism or Newar Buddhism here in Kathmandu Valley, in the capital city, one thing we see is animism and shamanism. That's where the sacrifice thing comes from, because despite of the fact that it's nowhere part of the true Buddhist schooling, these are very much in practices. Same with the Hinduism, Hinduistic, very ritualistic practices, because mostly it's animism and shamanistic practices as well. The Gadimai thing, we're still struggling. So all this thing, I think that is precisely why someone influenced, down the line through the evolution of the practices, despite of the purity, because throughout the history of these religions and religious domains, one religion has basically taken over the area of other religious domain or other religious or spiritual practices, whether it was animism or some sort of paganism, shamanism. That is why this amalgamation and practical kind of cocktailing or bastardization of religion and spiritual lines have basically been created, which is why I want to focus on the pragmatic side of using these influences in our favor, rather than focusing too much on the pure doctrine side of things, because we can take this discussion of doctrine to any level, only to see very less impact on the ground. So if you see it from the impact side of things, I think
that's a very valid point. Manoj, and Dr. Krishna has raised a hand to respond to that. Please go ahead, Dr. Krishna.
You're very, Manoj, you're very correct about the doctrinal part. But what I would like to say is that Hinduism has never been called a religion. It's a way of life. So you mentioned Gadimai. Now, the people there, that's their way of life. And Hindus in different parts of the world have their own way of life, their own rituals, their own practices. Similarly, with every religion, I mean, I have come across Catholics in Kerala and Catholics in Tamil Nadu. You cannot even say it's the same religion sometimes. It's so different. So I think all religions basically develop a way of life and their own ritual. The doctrine is there, it's sort of somewhere in the background. I think where it intersects with animals is where each group of people should maybe have a leader, maybe have an influencer who says that this doesn't go with what is in the religion, whether it's Hinduism or Buddhism or Jainism or Christianity or Islam, there's enough in all our texts to say that this should not be done and that is a better alternative. I think that is the thing, that is better. And I wish there were enough influencers in each group of people who could change lifestyles. Once you change your lifestyle, that you don't have to have that beef burger and you don't have to have chicken, whatever, chicken 65, is it? Then you start changing things. And that is, I think, what is required.
That is the
Change in
space. That is the
lifestyles.
space that I was advocating earlier. That there is this space for people like us, for interventionists and for impact makers to work together with these institutions, whether they're, we're going to call them spiritual institutions or religious institutions, because the need of the hour is to create those kind of influences, because it works, because it has worked throughout the history, whether for bastardization or for bringing it back in the track. Influencers have always worked.
There is a very interesting question which has come in. It's from a gentleman by the name of Bruce, who says that we may oppose certain religious practices, for example, the ecologically inappropriate release of birds, fish, and other captive animals into nature, or religious opposition to medically needed euthanasia. When should we argue on theological grounds and try to change the interpretation of doctrine? And when should we respect entrenched cultural practices and find the areas of common ground? I think that's what summarizes the discussions that, Joyce, would you like to go ahead? You've been quiet all this, so please go ahead. We started this entire conversation with your title of the presentation.
Well, as I sat and listened to the other speakers talking about those religions, it was noticeable to me that the text talk about vegetarianism and veganism impliedly, and yet we humans seem to always find a way to eat animals anyway and somehow justify it. We're very good at that. We're very bad at somehow getting beyond that. And I think that, frankly, is the crux of the matter for those of us who are devoted to animals and to not eating them and to not exploiting them and to moving away from their suffering. And Manoj, I'd love to hear more about how to be successful at that, because I have to say in my own life, I've not been able to influence a lot of my friends and my family members to stop eating animals. It's, to me, it's so core. I mean, there's this saying in the US and maybe it's elsewhere that peace begins on your plate. And it does. If you can look into the eyes of an animal and see the being who's there, you can't eat that individual. You simply have to stop. When I go into a store,
Joyce, sorry to interrupt, since you made this very important point. Life, whether it is a human, whether it is a plant, whether it is an animal, they all are living. So what about eating plants, for example, like vegetables, let's say?
Yes. That's where I throw up my hands and say, I can't be a breatharian. I have to eat something, and plants operate at a lower level, so they're the losers in that regard. But also, in the society I live in, it's not just me going into the backyard and killing a rabbit. It's a massive industrial complex in which animals suffer their entire lives and then face a terrifying deaths. I don't know that I can really compare the two. Maybe someone can answer that question better than I can.
Wolf, would you like to step in with your inputs?
Well, I would preface it that I don't have that much on the ground experience. I think that Nanditha and Manoj would probably have the most useful insights as far as on the ground balancing doctrine versus more pragmatic approaches. I would just briefly note that I am on the side of trying to argue for reinterpretation, since even both of the examples that were specifically given by Bruce, the ecologically inappropriate, the releases of animals, opposition to euthanasia, both of those have at their core a belief of compassion for animals. The problem is that it's being employed in a pragmatically counterproductive way. But if you can speak to people where there are, if you can say, okay, the why you're doing this is good, we just need to consider the consequences, I think that that can be a starting point by recognizing the opposition is on the level of practice, not necessarily that of theory.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's another very interesting question that has come in. It says that, has vegetarianism and not veganism been a rule of Hinduism?
Yes, veganism has never been a rule of Hinduism. Even vegetarianism is not a rule. It's a higher form of existence, a better form of existence. And everybody is encouraged to give up eating the flesh of animals. So that is a goal for everybody to attain. Those of us who are born or who from a young age have had the opportunity to be vegetarians, I think we are lucky. That is a result of good karma in a previous life. And those people who become vegetarians, they are creating excellent karma for themselves, because giving up something and taking a different lifestyle is not easy. So I think that's a wonderful step that they have taken. But veganism is not a part of Hinduism at all, because the cow and its milk are very much a part of the Hindu ritual. And it is, I mentioned that Rigvedic verse because nobody else has ever spoken about veganism. And it's just that in the Rig Veda, there is this one stanza which condemns drinkers of milk. So I had to bring that up, because
because we
came
have
across it quite by
Krishna.
accident.
Lord
And
Krishna,
the cows.
Makhan Chor, said in Hinduism. But I also think, Dr. Krishna, that earlier the calf was allowed to have his or her mom's milk, and then only the milk was utilized for the family members. It was not, so to say, commercialized or I would say that. So I think there was a different approach to consumption at that point in time also, which has kind of changed over the years with, human beings evolving.
I think it was Manoj who spoke about greed. In the past, it's very clearly mentioned in the texts that you can drink milk which the cow does not want. So which the calf does not want. So it's only after the calf has finished its quota that you can take the remaining milk. Today we are in a stage of commercial exploitation. Stall feeding. You pack 1,000 cows in one stall. You get rid of the calves. You are going to milk them with machines, not even with the help of the calf. That isn't what we are talking about, because that is commercial exploitation. And that is the tragedy of the animals, that commercial exploitation has put them in the situation. Whether you talk about clubbing seals to death in Canada, or about milk anywhere in the world, or meat, so many things. It's the commercialization which is the tragedy for animals.
Thank you, Dr. Krishna. And
Manoj. That was the
distraction. Go ahead.
Sorry, I know we're running out of time. That was the distraction that I was talking about, because and that is where the hard doctrine that were set in a completely different kind of social or otherwise setting sometimes tend to lose the relevance. So if you tend to strictly cling on the doctrine, it might not have a similar kind of impact or strength of impact in this era, in this social and otherwise setting, where there are so many distractions. Like this commercialization thing is a massive distraction. There are so many different factors, which is why, rather than focusing on doctrine, that there is this serious need to upgrade or contemporize and standardize these understandings of the doctrines as well. And made basically contemporized to today's very distracted or full of distraction society.
Absolutely, Manoj. One, I know we are totally out of time, but one quick question, food for thought. Uh, Given a choice, ahimsa or survival, what would one choose?
Survival, being very practical.
And your answer is?
It
So you
all,
If
asked
you
me.
survival, okay. All
Survival.
right.
it all
Okay.
depends on the context. I mean, if you find yourself in a desert and you've gone mad and you can't survive, God knows you may kill another human being and eat him up.
Exactly.
Why do you talk about an animal? But if you ask me logically, definitely ahimsa.
Yeah.
So it depends on when, where, what is the situation.
Absolutely. Joyce, Wolf, quick comments from you
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah, in theory, survival, but I live in a country where people are throwing out food all the time. So ahimsa. I would go for ahimsa.
I mean, I
Wolf?
think I certainly couldn't judge anyone who prioritizes survival. None of us know what we would do in a situation until we're there. I agree with Nanditha. People are seldom at their best when they're starving, but I think that spirituality and religion at its core is about ideals, and it's about transcending just that level of conflict and survival. So I think that, I mean, striving toward ahimsa or whatever one's highest ideal is in any tradition, I think is what really makes or breaks one's commitment to that
Very
tradition.
true.
So yeah,
Very
I'm
true.
for ahimsa. Let's set our sights high.
Wonderful. I think it's been a fantastic session, and we've had such great inputs from all of you. And thank you so much for the time, the effort, and the insights. And I end the session. I would love to just continue, but the time doesn't permit that. But I think I still take away from the session, if God were a verb and not a noun. I think that means so much. And thank you, all of you, for those wonderful presentations and insights. And we now enter into a break. We'll be back at 15:50 hours Indian Standard Time. That's 1550 hours. Do visit our exhibitors and stay well and stay safe. Goodbye for now.